Historiography. I realized while scripting a future video that I've never actually sat down and done a deep dive about historiography, what it is, how it works, and why we do it. A quick Bing search, I don't know, just go with it, will define it as the study of historical writing. It's a self-reflexive practice that keeps tabs on how a story's been told before, how it's changed over time, why those changes have been made, and by whom. Histories have been written and rewritten for decades, centuries, or millennia, and yet we keep writing about the fall of Rome, the Crusades, or World War II. Every time one of these histories is rewritten, the author will bring your attention to different elements of the story, or offer a new interpretation of the fact, or even bring new facts to the story, blowing old interpretations out of the water. For this video, I wanted to bring in a case study so that we could go through it together and see how a story has been changed over time. Now, there's a lot of topics I could have chosen where I'm just gonna lose people. You know, the people who are interested in social history might not be interested in military history, might not be interested in political history, might not be interested in environmental history. So, I went out of my way to find the most salacious history I could find that also had a decent historiographical section. You know, it has to actually be a history that engages with other histories. It is Caroline Marrow Long's Madame Lalaurie, Mistress of the Haunted House, which is the first and only academic history about this character. But as we're going to see, this story's been told in a lot of different ways over the years, but for the sake of continuity, let's start at the beginning with the newspaper reports. And the first paragraph does a really good job of summarizing the events, so I'm just going to read straight from the book. And even though this is a summary of the newspaper articles, there's a nifty little footnote because this is an academic history which refers you to a longer summary of the events in the main chapter on the incident. Delphine Lalaurie precipitous fall from grace occurred on the morning of April 10th, 1834, when a fire at her luxurious Royal Street home revealed 7 slaves starved, tortured, and chained in the upper part of an outbuilding. The nearly helpless bondspeople were carried to the Cabildo, City Hall, where they received medical treatment, food, and drink. 2,000 citizens came to view the victims. Appalled by what they had seen, the people began to gather around the Lalaurie mansion, expecting the sheriff to arrest the guilty party at any moment. But all remained quiet within the house, and as the day passed and the officers of the law failed to appear, the crowd became increasingly angry. When Madame Lalaurie escaped without punishment, the enraged throng attacked the empty residence. They stripped the interior of its elegant contents and continued their operations on the roof and walls. By the next morning, they had nearly demolished the house. Details of the fire and its aftermath, as reported by eyewitnesses, emerged in the local newspapers during the following week. The account was soon picked up by journals with national circulation. Madame Lalaurie was reviled as a monster, a demon in the shape of a woman, and a fury escaped from hell. Now, of course, this flyover version isn't complete and Long goes into much more detail in later chapters. And it's also worth pointing out that the newspapers that reported don't even share an interpretation among them. But we can put these newspaper stories together as one beat of the historiography. For one, because they share and agree on all of the same facts, and 2, because they were all reporting within days of the incident. They were all within the same time frame. And speaking of, the next entries in the historiography, a part 1B, if you will, are 2 travel retrospectives by 2 different European ladies who came to the US and did their own research and talked to people who had either known Madame Lalaurie or who had been there at the fire or were her neighbors and had seen certain things over the years. And these stories, while they come a few years later, are also stories that did a lot of primary research and added new primary research into the narrative. The first of these was Harriet Martineau, an English writer, who wrote the Retrospect of Western Travel. She introduces new sources, perspectives, and details told by friends who are familiar with the catastrophe. Martineau introduced the account of a little enslaved girl pursued by Madame Lalaurie with whip in hand from the courtyard through the house and out onto the roof, where the child fell to her death. This incident supposedly resulted in a criminal investigation and the confiscation of 9 of the Lalaurie slaves. Martineau was also the first one to give an account of Madame Lalaurie's escape on the afternoon of the fire. According to Retrospect of Western Travel, the lady's enslaved coachman arrived at the door with her carriage. She stepped in, and they flew at the gallop along the road to Lake Pontchartrain, where she boarded a schooner. She eventually escaped to France and took up her abode in Paris. Fredrika Bremer, a Swedish author, also had the opportunity in 1851 to travel to New Orleans and to meet people who had known Madame Lalaurie and to add little details into her retelling of the story as well. This is the last time that anybody adds new primary sources into their story, because the next telling wasn't written until 1889. What's interesting about these installments in the historiography, the travel writing as compared to the journalism, is that they don't intrinsically alter the interpretation of the facts. They bring in new facts, but they don't really change the way the story is told, the beats of the story, or why the story matters. Telling a story of another time that Delphine was cruel, or another time there was an investigation, it just adds support to the original interpretation that she was an especially cruel slave owner. The other thing that these stories do is that they expand the relevant time scale. They don't just tell the story of the fire, they go backwards in time. Another time there's an investigation. They go forwards in time, what happens after the big escape. This is most of what historiography is, to be honest. You look at these microscopic changes in how stories are told, and then you agonize over what that change might mean or might not mean for the overall narrative. But sometimes there is a radical shift, and when it comes to Madame Lalaurie, that shift comes with George Washington Cable's Strange True Stories. Strange True Stories! What a title! At this point, we are taking a sharp turn away from journalism and going right to entertainment. The story was periodically rehashed in newspapers of the 1890s, bearing headlines such as "The Haunted House," "Its Interesting History and Strange Romance." The local historian Henry Castellanos included a chapter called "A Tale of Slavery Times" in his 1895 collection of vignettes, New Orleans as It Was. The Haunted House was touted as a tourist attraction in the Picayune's Guide to New Orleans for 1897. So we've shifted genres a few times, from journalism to travel writing to tabloids. But there's still consistency here. All of the stories so far have assumed Delphine Lalaurie's guilt. But there's something else going on here too. The journalists went around and got the facts. Then the travel writers did some more interviews, and the facts that happen on site and what people knew of her, they go right together. They synergize really well, and it speaks to the truth in both of them. But what about this last category, the tabloids? They arrive at the correct conclusion, but they do it essentially by writing fiction. Not told to be accurate, but to make an entertaining spectacle about this one psychopath who used to live in New Orleans. So, that's one point of view, the more popular one, and when you bother to consult the facts, the one that the facts back up. But what about the other point of view? What if she did nothing wrong? And that's what her descendants in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s did. And these people would say anything to clear her name. For example, Coleman attempted to justify Madame Lalaurie's actions. He postulated that Delphine's mother had been killed by her own slaves, and that the crime and its circumstances so preyed upon the daughter that she brought to her Royal Street home 3 suspects, a man, a woman, and a girl. Crazed with grief, she tortured these slaves in the hope of making them confess. Now, spoiler alert, I did read the rest of this book, and I can assure you that this didn't happen. This isn't, that was just made up. Her mother died a very normal death, but even if she hadn't, is extrajudicial torture better? My favorite of these stories, however, is the descendants of Madame Lalaurie may have been responsible for the rumor that she refused to receive Cable, that's George Washington Cable, who wrote Strange True Tales, owing to his colored blood. and that he was motivated by spite to publish the story. Cable was actually born in 1844, 10 years after Madame Lalaurie fled New Orleans, and was a man of unmixed Caucasian ancestry. Oops! So now we're introduced to another thesis. Madame Lalaurie is innocent. Now the research methods are the same, if you want to call them research methods. Just making stuff up, really. Wild speculation, gossip, rumors. As Long puts it, popular historians and local color writers joined the discussion without offering any documentation for their opinions. These guys would gloss over any ugliness, drawing attention away from the events, and they would focus instead on her house or her aristocratic lineage, and if they did have to address the events, then they would talk about how, well, everybody's writing for an audience, they probably exaggerated what the eyewitnesses actually said, there's no proof. But even as her descendants tried to clean up the family name, there was the rumor mill getting wilder and wilder all the time. Right? Like, with people just making up stuff, why even pretend like you're not? Taking the opposite viewpoint, Lyle Saxon in Fabulous New Orleans and Herbert Ashbury in The French Quarter, An Informal History of the New Orleans Underworld, portrayed Madame Lalaurie as a sadistic monster while embellishing the story of the fire and the tortured slaves. But the crown jewel of this chapter of the historiography is Jeanne Delavigne's telling of the story, which is quoted at length in this book, but I do not think I can say out loud on this channel. I will put the text in the description and you can read it for yourselves, because Long describes this entry as disgusting details that are obviously the product of her perverted imagination. They're in the description. I'm not reading it to you. Now obviously, shock horror is not the only kind of entertainment you can get from a story like this. There's a lot of pleasure you can get from a slower character study, seeing how somebody can become this evil, why they do the things they do, and that's the impression that Long gave me when she described the novel Fever Season, that this describes how and why she does the things she does. It is a novel, it has a lot of things made up about it, but it's also meticulously researched. In contrast with the overblown productions quoted above, Fever Season is written with skill and subtlety. The story, with some variations, follows the accounts of the 1834 newspapers and the works of Harriet Martineau, Frederica Bremer, George Washington Cable, and Harry Castellanos. Hambley's book is particularly notable for the author's depiction of Madame Lalaurie's physical appearance and her character. Delphine is glowing with energy, with intelligence, with strength, a tall woman, imperially straight. Her voice was a lovely mezzo-soprano, her eyes were large, coffee dark, and brilliant. But her face was gouged with fine lines, more than simple weariness could account for. Her dress was always impeccable, severe but fashionable. In the novel, we first glimpse Madame Lalaurie's tyrannical nature when she bullies and humiliates her daughters during their piano lesson. We see a far more complex side when she volunteers as a nurse during a yellow fever and cholera epidemic. Holding a dying man who is befouled by his own bodily fluids, her face takes on a look of holy ecstasy, an expression of deep, intense pity, an inward look, yearning, longing, as if she knelt in meditation at the Stations of the Cross. She remains detached from the filth and stink around her, a woman whom no disarray or dishevelment could touch. She also has no sense of wrongdoing. Even during the fire, as the starved and tortured slaves are being carried out of the building and the crowd reacts with shock and horror, Madame Lalaurie stands by, calm as always, perfect as always, as if none of this had anything to do with her. And this kind of a slow character study, especially when you take a historical figure and make them fictional, can be a double-edged sword. Let's pay special attention to some of the details. Even fiction authors are trying to communicate something, to impart some idea into their readers' minds. If other stories existed to shock or to scare, this one is much more sympathetic to Delphine. It shows her doing horrible things, but it also introduces this kinder, more nurturing element of her nature, volunteering during fever season, doing nurturing work. Because I read this whole book, I know for a fact that that's a work of fiction. There's no evidence that she ever did that. And you have to watch for things like that. You know, just because it's elegantly written doesn't mean that fever season isn't doing some serious legwork to humanize a monster. In fact, the very acknowledgement up front that she did these horrible things serves as a kind of backdrop. You know, we know she did horrible things. That's why we're reading the book. Now, what about her side of things? Don't we get to hear about her struggles, even if those struggles were made up? Can you imagine if this is how we wrote about other serial killers? Like, sure, Jim Jones did a lot of terrible things. We all know this, but what about the man behind the monster? Can't we just make up some good and compassionate things that he totally didn't do in order to feel better about him being a good person, maybe? I'm honestly having a hard time deciding whether this is because the serial killer was a woman or because her victims were black, but maybe it's both. The most recent trend in telling Delphine Lalaurie's story is to make it supernatural. One example that Long gives is the graphic novel Nightmares and Fairy Tales, 1140 Rue Royale, written by Serena Valentino and illustrated by Crab Scrambly. This graphic novel offers an interesting twist on the story of the haunted house. In the late 19th century, a young girl called Rebecca and her elderly Aunt Victoria return from France to occupy the mansion that the aunt has recently purchased. Soon the ghosts of the tortured slaves begin to attack the older lady, but Rebecca is protected by a benign spirit. In a surprise ending, Aunt Victoria turns out to be Delphine Lalaurie, and her victims at last have their revenge. Now, Long stops there because this book was written in 2012, but in 2013, American Horror Story also puts a supernatural twist on Delphine Lalaurie. Kathy Bates plays her, and she is perfect. In this version of the story, Delphine Lalaurie is an immortal, and she spent the last 180 years trapped underground, just waiting to be freed, and then the witches of the coven dig her out, and she roams the streets of New Orleans, including she gets a job at the Lalorie house giving tours, and there she is telling the story. And of course she, much like her descendants, are focusing on the architecture and her family, whereas all the visitors are like, yes, but what about the blood and gore? That's why we're here. It's so good. Now, this general trend to fiction, both in historical fiction and in fantasy fiction, does a couple of things to how the reader is going to engage with the material. First, it's going to distance the audience from what they're engaging with. If you're engaging with a piece of media that's at least a little bit made up, and you know this because there's magic going on, then you're going to wonder, what else was made up? Was it really as bad as it's portrayed here? These are real crimes that happen to real people, and instilling a certain amount of doubt in your audience as to what they suffered and went through, it's not good history, is it? And I'm going to be honest, when I first watched American Horror Story, I had no idea that Kathy Bates' character wasn't completely made up. I had no idea that she was based on a historical figure because, I mean, they're witches. I thought the whole thing was made up. And the second thing that it does is it heightens the entertainment value, which cues the audience to engage with the story in a certain way. You know, it's not just about informing the audience of what happened and why it's important. You're trying to entertain them, which is a very different dynamic between author and audience. My last chapter in this historiography is going to be this book itself, The Historian's Perspective. Carolyn Morrow Long is a retired conservator from the National Museum of American History. So her job was to keep all of the documents that they collected, well, not all of them because they have millions, but to keep the documents that they collected in usable condition, either for display or for research purposes. And I thought it was kind of fun when I was reading through the notes in the bibliography just how many of her sources come from the National Museum of American History. And she also looked into archival sources, both in Louisiana and in private collections, and then I think there was some in some other states that she also looked into. My point is that there was a lot of documentary research and very little speculation. I mean, there was a little bit. She would say, now this may have been because of this, or this may have linked together like this, or this has been speculated, but I don't know if I can fully back this up. She was very careful to always put a little tag like, this is speculation, this is my opinion, or this could have been, but I can't prove it. And when you look at this book, the last quarter of it is just notes and bibliography. She is meticulous in her research. This is the definitive history on this woman. Now, just as a little note about how I engaged with this book, it was a strange book to read, partly because I've always heard of it as shock horror or supernatural horror. This is a slow academic history, and at times it's a very dry read. But as I kept going, I realized that Long had her work cut out for her. She's not a bad writer, but you have your work cut out for you when you try and write an academic history of something that people would usually tell around the campfire. And the story is not written to be viscerally entertaining. It does something else. What this book really does is it draws your attention to the research process. It underlines what you can prove and what you can't prove through an archive. It shows what's narrative and what's history. Now that brings us up to the modern day, and there haven't been any other major installments in the Lalaurie saga. Over the last 2 centuries, this story has taken on a lot of different forms based on agendas and the information that people have available at the time, and what people want out of a story and what they would think was entertaining. To a certain extent, with a story like this, it's up to the audience to decide how they want to engage with this story. You know, there's no point in telling somebody to read Long's version of the story if what they want is a ghost story, right? They're not going to find that satisfying. That said, there is one question that Long doesn't engage with very much that I think would open an interesting field of study, and that is what happens when you start telling ghost stories about real historical figures. How does that warp our understanding of what happened in the past? There might be nothing there, or it might change how people engage with reality in very interesting ways. There have been a couple of studies on how people engage with ghost stories more generally, but this might be an area for future research. What I've just done is something that a lot of historians will do at the end of their work. They will say, here's where the research can go from here, either as a dog ear for themselves to come back to later, or to prompt other historians to do that work themselves. Either way, whoever picks up the torch, this is an invitation for the next chapter in historiography. So that is historiography. It's basically a broad literary review of everything on the topic that you're about to write on that has come before. It's a way of contextualizing your writing for your readers so that they're all caught up on where the conversation is, and then you get into what you've got to say. And it might change format a little bit depending on the book. For example, there are a couple of Civil War histories who cannot possibly recount every Civil War history that's ever been written. So instead of addressing specific works, they'll address trends in Civil War history and go beat for beat rather than case by case. Other historiographies might be more thematic rather than content-based. This one is all about the story of Madame Delphine Lalaurie and the fire and the story, and that's it. But other histories are just as much about theory as they are about content. So they might reference a bunch of books that have nothing to do with the content, but are written in the same way. And those are just as important as the books that have come before on the same topic. But they're usually in the introduction, they're usually just a few pages, and you can get all caught up on the back and forth and what else has been written and why we're getting a new store now. Thank you so much for watching my video on historiography. I cannot believe I haven't done this one yet. This seems like the sort of thing I would have done in the first 6 months of my channel, but looking back at nope, I had not done this one. So thank you. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and if you really enjoy the content that I make, feel free to support me in my Ko-fi, link in the description below.